stand up or something.
Yeah. I don't know, I can do some wrestling moves, I guess. That's all I got. And some push-ups. I've been seeing more wrestlers at communist events lately. It's inspiring. It's a sign of the times, I think, that things are starting to change. The first wrestler I ever saw was Jeff Munson at the last Revolution Report event, but then at the Free America to Free Palestine event I went to, there were a couple guys who were wrestlers now in the workforce and fighting for communism, so that was awesome for me to see. Yeah, that presentation by Slava was really interesting, and thanks to the Revolution Report for hosting. It's great to see all these organizations coming together, coalescing to advance the class struggle, because that's what we need. But it was interesting for me too, because some of you might know my arch nemesis, Seabass. He's a Colombian diaspora type guy who says that I'm not allowed to talk about Venezuela because I'm not from there, and he doxed me and has released my phone number in public and things like that. But his main accusation against me is that I don't condemn Stalin, who genocided the Crimean Tatars. So it was interesting to hear Slava's speech, and that forced me to do a bunch of research about it. I'm like, oh, they all joined the SS. Go figure. Like, probably shouldn't have done that. But yeah, very interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about American Marxism specifically and American communism, because we know that Marxism and socialism in every country will take a national form. And even if you look at the US, there are different cultures across the country. So, reaching people in New York and California might be a little different than reaching people in Appalachia or in the Midwest. So it's important that we all understand our own conditions and learn to apply Marxist analysis and to build our own American Marxist theory. And Professor Danny Shaw is a member at Midwestern Marx, and he was on the Revolution Report the other day. And he said, because of Midwestern Marx, I've changed from, I can't remember exactly what he said, like an activist brain, coastal elite, to an American communist. And I think that's a positive development. I think that's where we need to move. Obviously, America is an imperialist country. It's a country that's done things that we're all ashamed of, but that makes our job more important, right? And we can't fall into national nihilism of rejecting the fact that we are a country, right? Which is what is being pushed with books like Jay Sakai's Settlers and a lot of ultra-left elements. We are a country. We are Americans. If you go anywhere around the world, you will be recognized as being American. And if you read the works of folks like Martin Luther King and American heroes, they stress that. Martin Luther King, one of my favorite quotes of his is, "We came here in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." And these ultra-left elements reject that, and they say, no, America's settlers, and what they're basically calling for is race war. Let's divide people by race and fight it out. That's not Marxism, right? Marxism is rooted in class struggle, which is why at Midwestern Marx, and this is thanks to Anthony Montero and the free school that he runs, he's really encouraged us to incorporate four figures: Henry Winston, James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King. And I think those figures are really important, especially because Americans care about those figures, right? You can talk to Americans about Lenin and stuff, and I encourage that, but Americans want to hear about their own history. They want to hear about MLK and that theory, what MLK and Du Bois fought for, who's actually right there, that's awesome. What they fought for it overlaps with Marxism. A lot of people consider W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which I think is a must-read for American communists. People consider that to be in the Marxist tradition. And it really is. If you read these Marxist analyses of the Civil War from during Du Bois' time, there's almost no talk about the slaves and the class contradiction between the slaves and the enslavers. And Du Bois not only makes an analysis of the slaves, but he calls them the black proletariat, which is huge because he's, for the first time in American history, putting black and white workers, or defining them with the same name. They're both part of the proletariat. And, we can't fight the class struggle unless we overcome this racial divide, which was the same thing that MLK would bring to fruition with the civil rights movement. And, at least legally, place black and white workers on the same playing field. Obviously, black Americans have to suffer with from the legacy of economic suppression and apartheid, but legally, the civil rights movement put them on the same playing field. So we consider the civil rights movement to be almost a third revolution in America. You have the revolution against British colonialism in 1776, you have the Civil War in the 1860s, and then you have the civil rights movement, which ends apartheid. So the next revolution is the socialist revolution, and that's what MLK himself was talking about when they killed him, or when he was killed. I guess we don't have proof, but I think we all have our suspicions. And now is 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. We're all drowning in debt. We're all watching our money be funneled into Israel and Ukraine. Now is the time for real American communist forces to come together, to coalesce, and to start building an American communist theory based off of course, our ideological mentors and leaders like Marx and Lenin, but also, with Du Bois and MLK. Like, Marx's Capital is wonderful. I'm reading volume 3 right now, but it talks a lot about the transition to capitalism out of European feudalism. We didn't have European feudalism in America. We had the Confederacy, and we had this slavocracy. We had indigenous people who were genocided in order to replace their mode of production with the capitalist mode of production. And that unique history needs a unique analysis. And that's where we see the value in folks like Du Bois and reading their work. In addition to talking about Du Bois and MLK and the American communist theory, I want to talk about this concept that I've been developing and writing about called hindsight anti-imperialism. I think combating hindsight anti-imperialism in this country is extremely important. So I'll explain what I mean by hindsight anti-imperialism. There are two forms of hindsight anti-imperialist. There's the politician hindsight anti-imperialist, like Barack Obama or David Frum. David Frum, recently, he was one of the architects and the main people pushing the Iraq War. And recently he published an article called The Iraq War Reconsidered, where he basically admitted that the whole thing was a mistake. But his goal in doing that was to lie and say that it was an honest mistake, right? We were actually trying to fight terrorism. We were actually trying to fight these bad guys. We just so happened to topple the government and allow ISIS to take power and stole all their oil, right? He doesn't want Americans to see the truth. Obama also called Libya his greatest mistake. But again, he's doing this, he's coming out as an anti-imperialist in hindsight, in order to convince you that it was an honest mistake. He doesn't want people to know that they took out Gaddafi because he had a socialist economic system and because he wanted to set up an African developmental bank, which is the real thing. So you have these politicians who come out and they're like, oh, sorry about the war I lied us into that brought slavery back to Libya or brought ISIS to power in Iraq, but you can trust me about the next war. You can trust me when it comes to Ukraine. You can trust me when it comes to Israel, because those were just honest mistakes. And we have to see through that, right? They weren't honest mistakes. The wars that the U.S. perpetrates around the world are for their geopolitical and economic interests. And that again gets to the importance of reading theory and forming these book clubs and educating ourselves, because once you understand Marx's theory, you can see through this bullshit, for lack of a better word. You can see through the lies and you see what it's all about. Of course, we're supporting Israel because we want a neo-colony in the Arab world, right? It has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. You don't support an apartheid state because you care about freedom and democracy. So the second form of hindsight anti-imperialist is the leftist anti-imperialist. And these ones might be a little more genuine, right? Like the Occupy Wall Street protesters who derided and spit at my friend Danny Shaw because he tried to do an anti-Libya war and anti-Syria war protest during Occupy. And they're like, what? These Occupy Wall Street protesters came up and were literally spitting on them and saying, you support dictators, you support Assad, you support Gaddafi. And then here they are, years later, after millions of Libyans have been forced to flee, many of them drowning in the Mediterranean Sea trying to get to Europe out of Libya. After slavery has been brought back to the country, after the socialist economic system has been dismantled and warlords and different terror groups have been allowed to take over a formerly stable and prosperous country. Now these leftists are like, oh yeah, that was bad. That was bad. Well, you were supporting it, right? So good job coming out against the war 10 years later, after we know that they lied about, WMDs or Gaddafi giving his soldiers Viagra or whatever propaganda lines that they push. Now you can see through it 10 years later. But what good does that do? It doesn't do any good. We need to be anti-imperialist when the media is beating the war drums, when the politicians are beating the war drums. And again, that's reading theory and education and what we call cadre formation too is going to be really important in combating that. So I encourage people to hit the books as much as possible. But when I hear stories like that from Danny about Occupy Wall Street, it makes me realize how rapidly and how much things have changed. Now you're having these giant anti-imperialist events, like the Free America to Free Palestine event, or like, this obviously isn't a giant event, but look at all the people in this room who are anti-imperialist socialists. I don't know that this would have been possible that many years ago, and I wasn't around, but it's a sign of the times that there's a more mature, less infantile communist movement forming in this country, and that's where we should get excited and take part in advancing the class struggle, educating each other and educating ourselves, because a real Marxist-Leninist movement is emerging in this country. It's finally happening, and we need to be there to keep pushing it. And when I come here to events like this, or when I go to the Free America to Free Palestine event, and I get to meet with so many people, I can't even put into words how much it inspires me and fills me with hope, and just fills me with happiness. Not only to know that the stuff that we're doing at Midwestern Marx is having a positive effect, but just to know that there are people out there who are also educating themselves, who are also dedicated to the struggle, who aren't hyper-obsessed with identity politics, who aren't anti-imperialists in hindsight, who are willing to do the reading and do the hard work that we need. Because, we do our work with Midwestern Marx, and a lot of it's online and stuff, and until recently we hadn't got to see all the people that we had influenced or on the ground doing the work that needs to be done, going into the trades, going into the unions, organizing workplaces. And to see that we have so many people in our community who are doing that, I'm like, wow, we're really actually doing something here. This country is actually going to change. It's inevitable. The real movement of history is actually coming. And it's also nice to see how many people are also fed up with the ultra-left elements that I am also completely fed up with. If you want to be a Democrat, go join the Democratic Party. But if you want to be a communist, you got to be a communist. And the American people are ready for Marxism, right? They love railing against the banks. A giant percentage of Americans don't trust the media. They don't trust our government. They recognize it's corrupt. So that's where we need to be there to meet them with a uniquely American communist theory. And it's not going to be telling them to read Settlers and move back to Europe, right? It's going to be talking about figures like Du Bois and MLK and what they did to advance our country, to better our country, to move it forward, creating the conditions of today, and creating the possibility of socialism today. There was no possibility of socialism in America before the Civil Rights Movement because they just had workers divided by race, right? But because of that, we now have the possibility for a real socialist movement in our multi-ethnic, multiracial country. So like I said, we have this theory that we call the American trajectory. It starts with the Revolutionary War. That's the first American Revolution. Then you have the Civil War, and then you have the Civil Rights Movement, and the next revolution is going to be the Socialist Revolution. And I think that's a really important theory for reaching Americans. And I tell MAGA people that we need to recapture the spirit of 1776 all the time. They're always like, yeah, they love it. I wrote recently in my defense of the MAGA communism strategy article about my wrestling coach, who's one of the greatest American wrestlers of all time. He just rails against the banks to me all day. He's like, think how much money you pay to the banks for your house. What do they produce? What do they provide? Nothing. He's like, we don't need them. We don't need our politicians. And it's like, yeah. And before he was scared of the word communism, right? But now he knows I'm a communist. He knows I'm a Marxist. And he knows we're in agreement on 99% of things. So he's much more open to these ideas. And, that's all we got to do is reach people with this theory. And also, it's important to be a good and upstanding member in your community too, so that you can gain people's respect, right? People will trust you, or they'll be more inclined to listen to what you're saying about politics if they know that they can trust you and they know that you're an upstanding and respectable person. So, which is another thing that I've noticed recently. So many dedicated leftists recently who are really committed to reading the theory, being upstanding members of their community, and I think Chris Halali is a fantastic example of that for all of us. So that's really encouraging as well. I guess that's all I got to say. But read Du Bois, read MLK, read Marx and Lenin. Any questions or comments?
I was just curious, you talked a lot about settlers, and I was wondering your opinion on the theory of settler colonialism.
I think it's a theory that applies to Israel, where there's an active process of settler colonialism going on, where you have these radical fascistic settlers literally pushing Palestinians out of their homes and just stealing their homes. But I talked to some indigenous comrades at the Free America to Free Palestine event, and they were like, that's not what's happening to us anymore, right? What they want is development, economic development, and political sovereignty in their areas, right? They don't want for all the white people to start labeling themselves as settlers and, move to Europe or whatever. It has, all that does is inflame racial conflicts, to be honest. What they want is development, because they're, indigenous people and people of every kind of background are living under capitalism. We're all dealing with the same exploitation and deindustrialization and financialization and debt trapping. It's the same for all of us, no matter what color we are. So it's like MLK said, we're all in the same boat now. So I think settler colonialism is fine as a concept. I think it's a concept that applies to America during the indigenous genocide, but that was over 200 years ago, The conditions have changed.
When you talk about things kind of like for example, you mentioned how Black Americans specifically are still dealing with the economic realities of slavery and of Jim Crow, but you don't, or at least it didn't seem like you were talking necessarily as much about the systemic oppression that occurs in the modern day and how Indigenous Americans are still being relegated to reservations that are kind of, I would say, intentionally bad. So I was wondering, I guess, what you would say about land back, or how you would acknowledge the very specific racialized struggles that Americans do go through, even though we all are Americans and proletarians.
Yes, I see those as forms of class struggle, right? So they're forms of class struggle that are based in specific kinds of oppression that specific racial or ethnic groups face, but it's still class struggle. Land back, I feel like, has been largely co-opted by liberals and corporate NGOs. The Land Back NGO specifically is being funded by Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and they're using it almost as a way to try and control the market and gain control of more areas. So at least based on what my conversations were with the indigenous comrades last week, they were like, we want economic development and political sovereignty, but we don't agree with this whole land back thing. For one, because it's been co-opted by corporations, and two, they feel like that land back just means putting them on reservations, which, like you said, haven't worked. They're not economically developed regions. So what they were saying was like, we want jobs, we want political sovereignty, we want to better our economic conditions. We don't just want to be placed on a reservation. by ourselves, separate from everybody else, with no economic development or and all the issues that we see on the reservations today. So.
Yeah, I had a question about, I don't know how much you've been following the convention of the CPUSA in
Very
the
close.
context of, American Marxism. By all accounts, it's been a bit of a clown show, pushing through resolutions or essentially tabling resolutions that are going to get passed that essentially just tie them to the Democratic Party. They published a piece recently that attacked you guys, lied about someone that we're on good relations with. What do you make of them, and what do you think the next decade or so looks like in terms of a real American communist movement and the party?
Yeah, I gotta be careful what I say, but CPUSA doesn't follow democratic centralism anymore. It's a cult of the National Committee. It's a cult of Joe Sims. I'll just say it. The second Genocide Joe. He runs it like a cult, and every year at the National Convention he overrides anything that goes against supporting Democrats, and then he'll purge those people from the party shortly after. And that's what I think we're going to see again. There's lots of information from people at CPUSA coming out about the convention now, and they did the same thing. There was the vote on Resolution 5, whether they should support Democrats or not. And basically, the consensus was that the vote, they did a vocal vote, a voice vote. They didn't actually count the voters, but the impression of the people there was that the anti-democratic side won, because you have there was just a big coalition of people who don't want to support the Democrats, especially with the genocide that they're sponsoring right now. And what they did was they said it was a tie. They tabled it, and then they gave the final decision to the National Committee, to Joe Sims and his cronies. And of course, they're going to vote to support Democrats because that's what they've been pushing for the last 20 years. That's their whole political basis. It's like, dude, if you want to be a Democrat, go join the Democrats. We're communists. But yeah, something needs to be done. Something is being done. Like I said, the real movement of history is happening. We're getting more and more real, dedicated communists involved who are wary of this BS that's going on. And it's not going to last forever. That's all I'll say. And it's not going to last very much longer. Anything else? Sweet, thank you.